Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for the sixth, I believe, in this semester's series of TGI FHI, the Franklin Humanities Institute's Friday morning series that gives Duke faculty in the humanities, interpretive social sciences, and arts the opportunity to present on their current research to interlocutors in their fields and in related fields, and allows you, the audience, to get to know our faculty. There is no agenda or theme indicated in the series, no demand to be disciplinary or interdisciplinary, to speak to a general audience or a specialized audience, just to present the work that faculty are doing that most excites them at this time. And while I regret that we cannot meet over breakfast and provide you with the forms of hospitality to which I hope you have become or will become accustomed if you're new to Duke, I'm delighted that we're able to include in this format colleagues and interested publics from near and far. On the website of the Franklin Humanities Institute, you can find recordings of past TGI FHIs and also an interview with Kevin in which he describes his work. This morning, I'm very pleased to introduce Kevin Richardson, who has recently joined us at Duke as assistant professor in philosophy. Kevin has been nearby for a while. He received his BA from UNC and started off his academic career at NC State after receiving, in philosophy and religion, after receiving his PhD from MIT in the areas of metaphysics and philosophy of language. His publications include work on the philosophical, specifically metaphysical concept of grounding or ontological dependence. A fundamental concept in metaphysics, it provides a way of understanding the relationship between what is fundamental and something that depends on the fundamental for its existence. In a recent article, he proposes a pluralist theory of grounding, in which one kind of grounding is necessary while another kind is contingent. And so these two types of grounding he calls what grounding and why grounding. What grounding tells us what it is for things to be the case, and why grounding tells us why things are the case. What grounding is necessary, he says. It corresponds to the idea of grounding as real definition. Why grounding, on the other hand, is contingent. It corresponds to the idea of grounding as metaphysical difference-making. This expansion of grounding also takes him to an idea of pluralist grounding through the idea of, through definition, through the study of definition. And he writes, quote, "We should endorse a kind of pluralism about grounding. In my view, real definition is just another species of grounding. Typically, we understand a species as its genus plus its differentia. For Aristotle, a human species is an animal genus that is rational, differentia. For me, a real definition, species, is grounding, genus, plus definition, differentia. The resulting pluralism is modest because it does not imply the disunity of grounding. It also does not imply the indefinability of the species of grounding. Nonetheless, it singles out a theoretically significant species of grounding, real definition. The sort of grounding, he argues, may be necessary while other kinds of grounding may be contingent." More recently, he has been taking these ideas specifically into an analysis of oppression, and I believe that is the work we are going to hear about today. And today, his talk is titled, "Are Black Men a Counterexample to Feminism?" Please join me in welcoming him to Duke. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much for that really great introduction. So I'm just going to jump right in, and I should say all the warnings apply. This talk is lots of bad things happen in this talk, so just to be warned. So our talk is entitled, "Are Black Men a Counterexample to Feminism?" And I want to start with a case to make things as concrete as possible. So who you're looking at right now is individual George Stinney Jr. So George Stinney Jr. was 14 years old when he was tried for the murder and attempted rape of two girls. It was 1944 in Clarendon County, South Carolina. George was Black. The girls were white. Upon being suspected of the murders, George was immediately taken from his home and rushed to the local sheriff's office. George was interrogated alone, without his parents and without the right to counsel. In less than an hour of interrogation, George was said to have confessed to all charges. George's trial, it was well attended. Over 1,000 white people kind of huddled in this small courtroom. No Black people were allowed in the courtroom. The all-white, all-male jury took 10 minutes to decide his fate, which was death by electric chair. George, being about 5 feet tall, weighing less than 100 pounds, could barely fit in the electric chair designed for grown men. As a result, the mask covering his face actually slipped down, supposed to cover his face, slipped down during his execution, and people in attendance kind of recorded just his last few pains expressions as he died. In 2014, George's case was vacated due to the lack of due process. And to this day, George Stinney Jr. is the youngest person ever sentenced to death in the United States. So Stinney's case is a horrific example of racial injustice in the United States, but you might go further than that. So Tommy Curry, in his recent book, The Man Not, argues that the treatment of George Stinney Jr. is just reflective of the treatment of Black men in the United States in general. So George Stinney Jr., as a young Black boy in 1944, was was incredibly vulnerable, right, in that state, but he was nonetheless seen as a beast, as a latent predator, as a sexual predator, a rapist. He was nonetheless seen in that way. And Tommy Curry argues that that's fundamentally how Black men in the United States are seen today. They are, on the one hand, the actual facts, show that they're very vulnerable. So Black men are imprisoned at higher rates. They're more likely to be killed in police encounters. They're less educated. They have less wealth. The medical health outcomes are worse, and so on. All of these things are happening to the actual condition of Black men. Yet nonetheless, Black men are still seen as these kind of vicious monsters or latent rapists or just men who are eager to oppress women. Now you contrast this, right? Or we think about contemporary feminism now, or the way people think about gender oppression. So a question arises, there's a question that I would say Tommy Curry asked in his book. Are theories of gender oppression, theories on which men, including Black men, oppress women, are those theories compatible with the actual social position of Black men in the United States, to be clear? Curry says no. He says that you cannot make a plausible case for thinking that Black men are also part of the oppressor class or part of that group of men who are oppressing women. And it's actually harmful to think as much. So his answer to this question is no. I'm going to argue that the answer to the question is yes, but there are lots of caveats to that, right? I think the relevant answer to the question says not simply something about kind of Black men in the United States, but in gender oppression, but it also says something about the nature of oppression, right? So that's going to be the preview of how I'm thinking about this talk. Okay, so first let's get clear on Black men and gender oppression and kind of what the arguments Curry seems to have for these claims. So let's start with the notion of gender oppression, what's going on here. So feminist philosopher Marilyn Frye, in her book, The Politics of Reality, Essays in Feminist Theory, says, it is a fundamental claim of feminism that women are oppressed. Furthermore, she says that women are oppressed as women by men, right? So men oppress women. She also says, men are not oppressed in virtue of being men, right? They may be oppressed in virtue of being working class or kind of other oppressed identities that one might have or inhabit multiple oppressed classes, but you're not being oppressed as men, is the idea. But women are oppressed as women, okay? And other kind of feminist philosophers and theorists think this. I mean, it's not universal, this way of articulating the claim of feminism, but it is one that's popular, at least in the circles of analytic philosophy today. And that's kind of the tradition in which I'm working in. So, but if you have this notion of gender oppression that's at the heart of feminism, or at least the heart of popular versions of feminism, then along comes, again, Thomas Curry with this book, The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and Dilemmas of Black Manhood, where he critically analyzes what is the role of Black men in this, account of gender oppression. Because, straightforwardly, you might think this: well, if men oppress women and Black men are men, right, then Black men also contribute to the oppression of women, right? So sometimes I'm going to say Black men oppress women, but I want to be clear that's a shortcut because that suggests they do it all on their own. That's not what I'm trying to imply here. The thought is that Black men, like other subgroups of men, contribute, right, to the oppression of women in some way. So that's one conclusion you might draw from kind of Fry's articulation of feminism, or foundational principle of feminism. And another conclusion you might draw is that Black men are not oppressed as men, right? They might be oppressed as Black people, right? But the thought goes, well, it's not your maleness in virtue of which you're oppressed. Okay, so that's what you might conclude. But Curry says no. That's actually not the case. If you actually look at the data, if you actually look at the position of Black men, you're going to find out both of those claims are false. And so to be clear, here are the claims. One claim is negative, namely that Black men do not oppress women. They do not substantially contribute to the oppression of women. Maybe have some Black men with bad attitudes or something, or hostile, but it's not a systematic thing. It's not a systemic thing. It's not a structural relation in society. So that's the one claim. Another claim is a positive claim, which is Black men are oppressed in virtue of being men, right? So the thought is Black men are targeted for their gender or sex. And that's why you see a lot of these bad outcomes for Black men. Okay. So he's kind of pushing against, he has a sustained critique of traditional ways of thinking about Black men in the context of feminist theory, right? His whole book's about this. I'm looking at these two particular claims. Now, what is the argument for these claims, right? How does he show this? Well, first, to give an argument, we really need to figure out what oppression means, or we need to establish what a definition of oppression is supposed to be, right? So I think that Ann Cudd offers a really good definition of oppression in her book, Analyzing Oppression, which was published a couple of years ago, kind of roughly the same time that Curry's book came out, I believe. And, she offers the following definition, general definition. She says that a social group A oppresses a social group B just in case A uses an institution to unjustifiably harm B, where this harm benefits A. So this is schematic, so it can apply to all sorts of different kinds of oppression, and oppressor and oppressed groups. But let's make this concrete, right? So when we're talking about the case of women, so let's look at how this definition might go. Men oppressing women. So a very simple case would be women's suffrage, right? So you have a group of men in the United States, and this group uses an institution, namely the law, to unjustifiably harm women by not allowing them the right to vote, right? And this not allowing them the right to vote benefits men, right? It gives them more political power because you're, by necessarily you're kind of depriving women of political power and increasing your own as a consequence as men, right? So that would be an example of the definition at work in the case of women's suffrage. Or you can use the case of kind of abortion rights, a more contemporary example, where men, you think as a body or collectively, using institution, namely the law, but also outside the law, but using the law as a way to kind of unjustifiably harm women by restricting the right to abortion. And the thought is, well, this kind of empowers men in various ways because it allows men certain amounts of control over women, essentially, or it by depriving women of certain kinds of healthcare, then they, men end up having more power over them in that regard, right? So, those are two concrete instances where you might apply Ann Cudd's theory. And so, hope that gives you a feeling for why it's useful. It identifies, I think, crucial aspects of what's necessary for oppression. So we're not just saying oppression is just anything that harms people oppression is not just being sexist against someone, it's not just being racist against someone, it's about being sexist or racist in a particular way, right? Where you get some harms and some benefits, and it's unjustifiable, right? Okay. So now that we have a concept of oppression on the table, let's revisit what's the context of Black men. How do we, how do we make sense of whether or not Black men are part of the oppressor group of men? So Curry has this concept of Black male vulnerability that he outlines in his book. And he says, Black male vulnerability is the term I use to capture the disadvantages that Black males endure compared with other groups, the erasure of Black males' actual lived experience from theory, and the violence and death Black males suffer in society. So he talks initially about disadvantages that Black males endure compared with other groups. So he lists a lot. I'm going to give just a couple because we could be here quite some time otherwise. So key features, right? Key disadvantages: incarceration. So for example, in 2009, around 841,000 Black men were incarcerated, which is far more than the 64,800 Black women who were also incarcerated. So Black men compared to Black women are incarcerated, much more. And it hasn't changed since, well, it hasn't changed much since 2009. Police violence: Black males are victims of fatal police shootings at considerably higher rates than non-Black people and Black women. For example, in 2015, 306 fatal police encounters with Black people were recorded, but 294 were Black men. And I should note that the statistics on kind of fatal police shootings, it's not great because police departments don't want to track a lot of stuff or make it public. But the few records we do have suggest that this is a common, this kind of discrepancy is real. Homicide. So from 2002 to 2017, homicide was the leading cause of death of Black men between 15 and 34. So, and I think, this little table on the right here shows from 1 to 44 actually, but this is a little more recent data. But in any case, the point is that homicide, leading cause of death of Black men. And Curry goes on, to also talk about sexual abuse against Black men is actually very common. People don't talk about the amount of sexual abuse against Black men. There's also, questions around Black men in labor and unemployment, health outcomes. I didn't give all of the kind of information that's relevant here. But my point is just to highlight some key features of Black male disadvantage, both with respect to non-Black people and also Black women. But this isn't just, Black male vulnerability is not just disadvantage. So Curry says the term Black male vulnerability is not meant simply to express the material disadvantages Black males face due to incarceration, unemployment, police brutality, homicide, domestic and sexual abuse throughout society, or their victimhood. Right? The term is also meant to express the vulnerable condition, the sheer fungibility of the Black male as a living terror, able to be killed, raped, or dehumanized at any moment, given the disposition of those who encounter him. So I think this is extremely important to highlight here. Curry's not just listing a bunch of disadvantages and saying Black men have it bad or Black men have it bad relative to Black women. He's saying that these particular disadvantages, especially when we look at incarceration, police brutality, homicide, right, unemployment, these particular disadvantages are evidence of a certain kind of position that Black men occupy within society, a position of, you are, for lack of a better term, killable. You are socially licensed to be killed. You're socially licensed to be raped or dehumanized. You're socially licensed. Your life, of course, is taken to not matter, right? As a structural position. So this is what he thinks is important about the concept of Black male vulnerability. Now, if you have that, if you buy the story that the account that he gives, right, then it would suggest that if Black male vulnerability is widespread, then that's incompatible with Black men oppressing women because Black men won't have the power to oppress women if Black male vulnerability is an actual fact about United States society. And also, they don't really benefit from the oppression of women. Remember, the definition of oppression here, and it's a common constraint or common requirement of oppression, is that you get some benefit from it, right? The oppressor group benefits in some way. But if you look at kind of what Curry describes, it's not clear that there's actually any benefit, right? So that's that's a reason to think that Black men don't oppress women, that this account is actually is inaccurate. Maybe other men do, right? But not Black men, not systematically. Okay, so that's the negative. I mean, that's the negative claim, an argument for the negative claim he's making. Black men do not oppress women. What about the positive claim? What about the claim that Black men are oppressed in virtue of being men? What's the evidence for that? Well, we have to go back to the case of George Stinney Jr. So George Stinney Jr. experienced a kind of sexualized racism, right? The reason why he was targeted and wrongfully and unlawfully targeted for the murder and rape of these two white girls, because he was thought to be a Black man specifically, and Black men are supposed to be latent rapists and sexual predators, beasts, people who cannot control themselves sexually, right? This was a kind of sexualized racism. In fact, Curry appeals to this notion by educational theorist William Smith, Black misandry. He says, Black misandry is an exaggerated pathological aversion toward Black males that is created and reinforced in societal, institutional, and individual ideologies, practices, and behaviors. Like Black misogyny or aversion toward Black women, Black misandry exists to justify and reproduce the subordination and oppression of Black males while concomitantly erecting edifices of racial and gender inequality. So the thought here is that Black misandry, this is the kind of ideological component, right, that drives these material disadvantages that Black men experience. So using Stinney Jr. as a kind of paradigm case, look, this kind of Black misandric attitude, it drove, right, and to some degree, people to kind of target him in this way. And the thought here is that this kind of ideology is widespread. And what that means then is that Black men are being targeted by their sexuality in such cases, right? That's the idea. So I have an example, but I'm going to skip that in interest of time. So the conclusion here is that Black men are oppressed in virtue of being men because of the existence of widespread Black misandry. Oh, sorry, widespread racist misandry is the idea, right? You're being targeted because of your melanin. That's how I reconstruct this claims. So just to review, right? Curry's conclusions. One negative, Black men do not oppress women, right? Another positive, Black men are oppressed in virtue of being men. Okay, and I've given what I take to be arguments for that. Negative case is Black male vulnerability is incompatible with oppressing women. The positive case, Black racist misandry is what drives a lot of these things, and therefore Black men are being targeted for being men. Their maleness does not advantage them. Okay. Now, let's consider some responses to Curry's work. And there are two basic responses I'll talk about briefly. So the first response is the empirical response. So this is the idea that Black men are not disadvantaged to the extent that Curry claims. Alternatively, Black women are more disadvantaged relative to Black men. So either Curry has inaccurate data, or he thought he had data that he actually doesn't have. Alternatively, if you really look at the picture, Black men or Black women are actually doing a lot worse. That's the kind of response you might have. So there hasn't really been, to my knowledge, there hasn't been much in the way of showing that Curry's kind of really wrong about his empirical claims. There's been, there hasn't really been much, I think, empirically confronting Curry. I think people do note that Black women do earn less than Black men. But again, I don't think that threatens the concept of male vulnerability, Black male vulnerability, because there are lots of different factors. And again, I don't think, identifying Black male vulnerability is not a matter of just juggling, who's more disadvantaged at what. it's about identifying a structural position. So there really hasn't been a great empirical response. And also, I think methodologically, I don't think it's a good idea to simply try to ignore what the facts seem to be telling us here. I mean, he has extensive empirical documentation. Some of the interpretations I myself question, but in general, there's not many responses like this, and I'm not really sold on these kind of responses. More common is the intersectional response to Curry. So intersectional response is something like this. Look, Black men aren't oppressed in virtue of being men, but they are oppressed in virtue of being Black men specifically, right? So their oppression is intersectional. So this comes from different accounts of intersectionality, kind of made famous in ways like Kimberly Crenshaw and kind of others in intersectionality theory and sometimes multidimensionality theory kind of talk about the specific intersections that intersections where you get oppression on the one hand. Now, I think this is actually helpful. The intersectional response, I think, is helpful in terms of thinking about why it seems like Black men are targeted specifically, why their maleness has something to do with the way they're treated. But this doesn't really answer the question of whether Black men oppress women full stop, or whether Black men are part of the class of men that oppress women. I suspect kind of intersectional theorists will just deny the utility of saying things like men oppress women. It's too general. Maybe you need to say things like these particular men in this particular context oppress these particular women. And that's a way you could go. I tend to think that's giving up the game. I think that there's utility in being able to say these kind of general things. I think there's utility in generalizations. And so, for that reason, I don't think that response, that kind of response is entirely convincing to me, but maybe we can talk about it if you'd like. So in general, I don't think there's been really great responses to Curry's work. But I think Curry really raises an important challenge that should be recognized and should be really dealt with. Okay. So now I want to kind of talk about how I think we can understand what's going on here. And I think that means we need to revisit or revise the theory of oppression, maybe. So let's just take a step back for a second, right? What do we think that oppression requires here, like on an ordinary concept? So here's some things you might think. Oppression, right? If some group oppresses another group, right? If A oppresses B, you might think that the degree of harm that A inflicts on B must be great. You might think that the benefits that A receives by harming B must be great. And you might think that A generally has power over B, right? So Black men, in this case, would inflict a great deal of harm on women. They would get a lot of benefits from inflicting harm upon women, and they would have so much power over women in general, or at least Black women, right? Those are some things you might think fall out of the claim that Black men oppress women. But I don't think that's the case. And I think because we believe that oppression requires so much, we're led to think Curry's claim that Black men couldn't possibly contribute to the oppression of women. Okay, so here I'm going to give an example of how oppression might be easily achieved despite a lack of power, benefit, and harms within society. So let's use something specific like misogyny. So Kate Mann recently, she came out with a book called Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, where she gives an account of misogyny and the function and definition of misogyny. And she says that, we should think of misogyny as serving to uphold patriarchal order. Misogyny does this by visiting hostile or adverse social consequences on a certain, more or less circumscribed class of girls or women to enforce and police social norms that are gendered, either in theory or in practice. So on the one hand, she talks about cases. So the thought is misogyny has a certain social function, its function is to keep the patriarchal order going. Patriarchal order is a social order in which men dominate, subordinate, or are just better off relative to women. Well, how do you do that? Well, I mean, she looks at some pretty kind of extremely violent cases of like the case of Elliot Rodgers, who's on the crusade to kill women because they, didn't seem to want him, or by his perception that they weren't behaving in the ways that he thought women should behave. So this was, this kind of violence is a way of, threatening, well, first actually harming women, but sending a message in general that here's, how you should behave. Here's how women should behave towards men. So that's a kind of extreme case of violence when it comes to misogyny. But on the other hand, misogyny doesn't necessarily have to take that form, right? It can take the form of simply belittling a woman, different ways of trying to quote unquote keep women in their place by saying certain things about them, insulting them. Misogyny can be a lot less than these kind of extreme cases of violence and explicit writing a manifesto about why you attacked a woman or why you threw acid on a woman for these reasons. Misogyny doesn't always take this kind of form. And that's going to be important because let's think now not just about misogyny in general, but about misogynar. I can never quite say this term correctly, but this idea of misogynar is one where we think about misogyny in the particular context of Black women. So Moya Bailey coined this term to describe a particular brand of hatred directed at Black women in American visual and popular culture. So this initially came out of kind of controversies where way Black women like Leslie Jones are being treated in the public eye. And so, I think of this as a kind of misogyny in this particular context, kind of belittling certain women as a way of enforcing certain norms of a patriarchal order. And I think, one way in which you could get misogynar and you can get Black men in kind of contributing to misogyny, which contributes to the oppression of women, would be something like the following. So, so there's all sorts of, I don't know if people heard of red pill communities, these kind of misogynistic kind of individuals with patriarchal ideology. But, there's this individual who's a dating guru, calls himself an image consultant, Kevin Samuels. I don't know if you've heard of him. But he's a YouTuber and consultant whose his whole program is to go around and give Black women and also non-Black women, but a lot of these cases, Black women kind of dating advice, quote unquote. But one thing you'll notice quickly if you watch his videos is that his dating advice is, he does things to basically he's ends up being misogynistic toward women, where we can understand this in the way that man understands being misogynistic. So to give an example, this individual recently went viral because he was talking to a woman, a Black woman, a dark-skinned Black woman who said she wanted a man who made six figures, or he was quote unquote high value man. And he asked her, about, way she looks like, how does, he asked her, okay, what do you rate yourself? Right. I think she responded something around a 6. And, he says, you're average at best. Right. And you want a 6-figure, you're high value man. And this went viral. Right. And part of the reason why I think a lot of men were attracted to this, I really like this, because it was an example of, a man kind of putting a woman kind of in her place to embarrass this woman for thinking that she should be with a certain person, because she needs to behave in a certain way. She needs to look in a certain way in order to accomplish, right, having a certain man. I take that to be another example of misogynar. And I want to emphasize here, it's clearly not the same as kind of violently and aggressively kind of attacking someone, right? So, there are different levels of harms being involved, and the men who might contribute to this different levels of benefits to be involved. So my point though, right, and this is what I want to make here. I'm making the conceptual point really. So misogyny contributes to the oppression of women. I think that's plausible, but it doesn't require large amounts of social power, nor does it require large amounts of harm or benefit. So look, my claim, and I want to be very clear about this. My claim, I'm not here to argue that Black men oppress women, right? That's not the force of my argument. My argument is that Black male vulnerability is compatible with Black men contributing to the oppression of women, right? I think that conceptual point is useful because I think that we have to be clear about what oppression is supposed to be. And I think adding more into the concept of oppression, thinking that oppression requires all of this, oppression requires a great deal of social power, or that it requires a great deal of harm to be had or a great deal of benefits. I just don't think that's accurate. I don't think that's what the concept of oppression is supposed to be for, because if it were, it seems like it would not be very useful, because I'll put it this way, Black men are not an exception in many ways in terms of being vulnerable, right? At least globally, like you have lots of classes of men who would suddenly drop out of being part of the oppressor male class. So again, the claim I'm making is Black male vulnerability is compatible with Black men contribute to the oppression of women. Maybe Black men don't, right? That's, I haven't given you empirical evidence for that. But I think the conclusion that Curry reaches is a bit premature. And second, you consider the question of are Black men are oppressed as men, right? Is that true? They're oppressed in virtue of being men. I have a different kind of argument against this. So to me, the argument that Curry gives, as far as I can tell, and I can be wrong about this, but to me, the argument feels like racist misandry targets Black men rather than Black women. Therefore, Black men are oppressed in virtue of being men. It seems like that's the argument that's on offer here. That look, because like Black men are being targeted in part because of their gender, that must mean that Black men are being oppressed in virtue of being men. But so overall, I don't think this is, I don't think this really singles out what it should. So a couple of arguments here. One, by parity, I think we should conclude that white women are oppressed as white people. They're oppressed in virtue of being white, because white women are going to be oppressed in particular ways that concern their being. White women are going to be treated under the sphere of patriarchy. White women are going to be treated in particular ways, when it comes, as opposed to the way Black women are going to be treated. But normally people don't conclude that, well, white women are being oppressed because of their whiteness. They think, well, look, you're oppressed in virtue of your gender. The race is nonetheless a kind of form of differentiation. Like what form will the oppression for white women take as opposed to Black women, right? So one, I think it ends up, this kind of reasoning ends up giving us absurd conclusions. And the flip side of this is that the common factor here is race, right? So Black men face misandry, racist misandry. Black women face misogyny. But whether you're a Black man or woman, or Black man or a Black woman, excuse me, you would still be a target of racialized sexism. The racialized sexism is going to come whether you're a Black man or a Black woman. But if you're a white man, you wouldn't have been a target of racialized sexism, right? That's the idea. So there's actually kind of asymmetry, right? You hold the Blackness fixed, and yeah, you're going to get different kinds of sexism with, depending on your gender. And also, depending on your sexuality, there's more to it. But as soon as you toggle the dimension of race to, like white man, then things change drastically. And to me, this says that the way in which you are racially oppressed or how you're racially oppressed will differ according to your gender, right? So I think the racist misandry point is a good point, but it doesn't imply, in my view, that the reason why you're oppressed is your gender. So I have more work on this distinction between the why and the how. So this is related to my work on kind of grounding, which was mentioned earlier in the introduction. So I'm not going to go through the technical difference here in terms of what's the difference between the why and how exactly, but the kind of intuitive claim is just, on the one hand, I'm, the gender in the case the race in the case of the way George Stinney Jr. and other Black men experience this racialized sexism, the race is the factor, and then the gender is the differentiator, right? There are cases where, for instance, Black women, they are double jeopardy, as people have named it. They are, oppressed in virtue of being Black and oppressed in virtue of being women. So you have cases like that. But I do think the case of Black men is a case where you're not, your maleness isn't really the reason why you're being oppressed. Your Blackness is the main reason, and then maleness is just a particular way, because now you just want to differentiate between how am I going to oppress this particular Black man versus this particular Black woman, right? That's the way I'm thinking about this claim. So I don't think that Black men are oppressed in virtue of being men. Okay. So despite the difference in how racialized sexism targets Black men and Black women, being Black, I think, is the common factor here. So let me just restate my conclusions, just for people to be clear. First, Black male vulnerability is at least compatible with Black men contributing to the oppression of women, because Black men could, for example, participate in misogyny or misogynoir. Okay. Now, again, this is a compatibility claim. I'm not here to argue, and I don't think it's good practice to just argue, oh, I'm going to show you how Black men are oppressing women. I'm saying, look, this seems compatible. And, when you look at the work of feminist theorists who talk about the ways in which Black men, so like Bell Hooks, when she talks about her experience with Black men contributing to patriarchy, a lot of times she's mentioning things that are not institutional in the way that kind of laws are. So maybe Black men don't have as much power to affect these laws in the way that the kind of paradigm examples of men oppressing women, right, in terms of depriving the right to vote or the right to abortion. So maybe that's not what's going on. The kind of cases they mention are cases, kind of within the home, and certain attitudes that are taken. Again, these kinds of attitudes, this kind of misogyny, and these kind of expectations about where women should be, and kind of punishing them when they don't conform to certain expectations, these things may not be as harmful as other forms of misogyny, right? It can be a huge difference in terms of how they go. But I don't think that shows that Black men are contributing to the oppression of women. It just shows that, the harms and benefits are very different, right, relative to other men. So that's one claim. The second, Black men are not oppressed in virtue of being men because the race is the fundamental basis for the ensuing racist misandry. So I think that, yes, it is true. We do need to pay attention to racist misandry, and people have neglected the sexual abuse of Black men like a lot. But I don't think that shows that the male factor is the thing that makes them, the male factor is what's the basis for their oppression. Okay. So those are my conclusions. Now, I want to briefly, in the last 5 minutes, just say a little bit about the consequences of this theoretical apparatus, because I do want to be clear, because the things I'm saying can be misconstrued quite easily. So, the concept of oppression that I'm working with doesn't give you as much as people have traditionally thought. So knowing that Black men oppress women does not give you a political strategy, right? So one conclusion you might draw from this is, oh, well, if Black men oppress women, then, doesn't this imply that, women should unite as a class against Black men, or the class of men in general, but which includes Black men? No, I don't think that's necessarily true. So there might be cases where you might be cases where it's strategically better for the liberation of women's, for kind of Black men and women to actually work together and organize together, maybe under the guise of Black people, because of the issue of Black male vulnerability and misogynoir, against Black women. So saying that one group oppresses another doesn't really tell us how we should do our politics in a straightforward way. It doesn't give you a political strategy. That's something I want to make clear. Another thing is that knowing that Black men oppress women, it doesn't prescribe the appropriate attitude toward Black men. So if you come away from this and think, oh, you said that Black men oppress women, so I guess that you should, have a kind of hostile or uneasy attitude toward Black men, or you should be afraid of them. No, I mean, that's also another, I think, conclusion that that shouldn't be made from this fact about oppression. I think there are a whole range of attitudes that maybe you should have in light of like knowing, for instance, that Black men oppress women, or thinking that Black men oppress women. Look, this doesn't give you, it doesn't tell you like how you should approach particular Black men and Black boys. Like this is perfectly compatible with loving Black men and loving Black boys. It's perfectly compatible, wanting to have a long-term relationship with Black men, and having Black children and your Black boys and loving them. That's perfectly, those are compatible things. Now, here's one thing I will say. It sounds bad, at least amongst people who aren't racist against Black men. It sounds bad to say that Black men oppress women. It seems like you're singling Black men out. It seems like a really bad thing. But I mean, part of this, I think, is because we tend to see ethics through the lens of individual behaviors, intentions, and character traits. I think there's immediately this idea. So once you take in some normative conclusion, that is some ethical conclusion of the form, Black men oppress women, and we're taking oppression to be a bad thing, right? It's by definition, it's unjustifiable. Then there's a rush to think about, oh, well, I guess these particular men are monsters, or these particular men are just doing bad things, or these particular men are behaving in this way, and so I should react to this man in this way, or this particular man has certain intentions, and when they do certain things, I think this is a mistake. I think that this is a kind of artifact of the culture that we live in. I mean, I think that identifying a structural relation, right, within our society of Black men oppressing women, or men oppressing women, or white people oppressing Black people, it's not about your individual behaviors, intentions, or character traits. And so I think if you think in this way, however, it will lead you to build a lot into how you're going to react to Black men as a consequence. So that's my explanation of why I think it can seem bad to say things like this. So I've said a bunch of things that don't follow from the theory of oppression. So what does? You're saying, oh my God, what do we need a theory of oppression for then if nothing follows from it? So here's one thing it does do. So I endorse a minimalism about a theory of oppression. Knowing that some group oppresses another simply tells you the fundamental basis for more structural, for more specific kinds of structural harms, right? Again, you have the race factor, and then you toggle gender, right, in certain cases. Or you, in certain cases, you have the gender factor, and then you toggle maybe the race, and then the kind of gender oppression comes out in different ways. This is the function, I think, of the concept. I mean, this is what I think the concept of oppression is useful for. And we can have a theory that has a concept of oppression that works this way, and we can also have theories of intersectionality, which make sense of the particular ways in which people are oppressed, right? It makes sense of the how here, whereas the oppression, it answers certain why question. So I hope that I hope that you come away thinking that, look, on the one hand, Curry is actually right about a ton of things. But on the other hand, I think, we do need to acknowledge the role that disadvantaged men can play in the oppression of women, but acknowledge that without reaching all sorts of grand conclusions about how in particular these men should be treated, or whether they have certain attitudes or intentions. No, I think we should reconstruct the notion of oppression on a more minimalistic basis. Thank you. That's my talk.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So we have time now for questions. Just a reminder, as a reminder to our audience, you can put your questions in the Q&A. And maybe I'll just sort of start off with one, Kevin, while people are thinking up their questions at the moment. I mean, I'm curious about how you sort of understand. I mean, you talked about the work on intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, etc. But also, I mean, I feel as if you've moved from Marilyn Frye, who's a very particular kind of feminist, right? Understood herself to be a radical feminist, for your definition of oppression. I know that she worked on oppression as one of her categories of analysis. But I mean, when I learned feminism, as it were, we are, I mean, and it's not taught in this way anymore, but it was basically sort of the groundwork was like, here's radical feminism, here's psychoanalytic feminism, here's Marxist feminism, here's socialist feminism, etc., etc. And so I suppose I'm curious as to why you go to this definition of oppression that is very, very particular, is from the early 80s, I think. I'm not sure, but is from a particular moment of radical feminism, when there are a number of other kinds of, there's that now what 56, there's 50, 60 years of these kinds of distinctions among types of feminism in the scholarship that are in place, some of which one might say in the Marxist feminist tradition, for example, looks to Marx and Engels for notions of oppression that are, somewhat different and distinct from the type that you're talking about. So why Frye, and how does that work sit with the body of feminist scholarship that has come since then?
That's an excellent question. So, one thing, so there are two things. So one is you think you're right to notice particularity of that kind of definition, the Marilyn Frye, and also thinking about Catherine McKinnon, like similar, I think the similar kind of spirit of the definition of oppression. And, people since then have not only found kind of Marxist feminists and socialist feminists, not only have found kind of different aspects of kind of women's oppression, but they've also, you have people who quote unquote Foucauldian theory of power, who say, look, you're already off by saying something as simple as men oppress women. That's already not a very helpful way to understand feminism or anything, right? More or less, that's you're already kind of off on the wrong start. And so there's a question of, okay, why use this kind of old-fashioned notion of oppression, or at least oppression of women in the context of feminism? Why use this kind of old-fashioned distinction, old-fashioned way of articulating oppression when we've gone so much further than that? I do want to say that so I'm working and this is something I didn't get a chance to kind of say much about, but I'm working within a tradition of, I think, sometimes called analytic feminism. So I'm working in the context of analytic philosophy, which broadly, and this is going to be very inaccurate, but I got to say something about analytic philosophy. Broadly, this spirit of taking concepts and kind of analyzing things into discrete components. And so that's not a very popular kind of methodological approach for a lot of feminists. It can seem very problematic. But one thing I will note is that that Frye McKinnon style feminism is very popular within analytic circles. You might say a lot of analytic feminists are just unreconstructed second wave feminists, just trying to bring things back. So one, I mean, that's a pragmatic reason, but there's a more fundamental reason why I use that definition of oppression, because to me, the reason why I like Ann Cutt's definition, so I think Ann Cutt is like a liberal feminist, but what's nice about her definition, though, is that it's sufficiently general and abstract. And so part of what I'm interested in is using a concept that's general enough that I can plug different things into it. Because again, from my analytic philosophy background, what I want to do is to then add different elements to it and see how those different parts interact systematically. So if I have a concept of oppression like Ann Cutt's a concept, which is very general, right? And some people think, well, maybe that's a problem and it's so general. But again, the benefit of it is that not only can I talk about gender oppression, but I can talk about race oppression. And I can talk about like oppression on the basis of sex, insofar as that's different from oppression on the basis of gender. And then I can throw in misogyny as playing a particular role when it comes to oppression. So part of the reason why part of what justifies, I think, the comeback of these rather simplistic notions is that they're simple by themselves, but then when we start adding more tools to it, I think we can recover in the end, and this is something that I want to work on in the future. I think we can recover a lot of distinctions that people are still making today, especially around intersectionality. I guess I don't see them from an analytic framework. I don't think they necessarily have to be incompatible, given a certain analysis. But I mean, look, but I think you're right. I mean, what I'm doing is very contested, right? People should, a right to say, what is going on here? This is in the 80s. come on. Aren't we done with this? That's a legitimate, issue.
I mean, I think, thanks for that answer. And I mean, it is really clarifying, and I mean, I sort of feel like the huge body of feminist work has really been about a kind of resistance to McKinnon, etc., as you say, and radical feminism, for better and for worse, right? I mean, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the right way to go, as it were, but partly, I suppose, it's a question too about being accountable to other concepts of oppression that are also broad, and to some extent, if you take how does one understand this in terms of fundamentals, if you like, right? If you take a kind of one version of oppression, then isn't that inevitably going to be inadequate to the task, if you see what I mean? Or isn't it going to be so simple that it's sort of inevitably the case, right? So I mean, I suppose that it's partly that I would just love to have you, not necessarily right now because there are other questions here, sort of say more at some point when we can do this over coffee about how one sort of understands that problem. It's not even that it's old. I mean, I'm sort of interested in, Kant's notion of hospitality, for example, and so it's not that it's old. It's old. It's an old definition. It's a question of how one actually thinks about it in relation to these other kinds of concepts of some, when you're working on definition and oppression. So, but I think that we should go. I mean, you can say something if you want, but we could also just go to some of the other very interesting questions here. We have a couple of anonymous ones, which is a little unusual, but you know, so someone's asking about the implications of what you propose for feminism, or particularly Black feminist, womanist initiatives, theories, scholarship. What these things should, what these bodies of work should do, to either a specific sense or a kind of broad stroke sense. I mean, I think that you sort of came to that in your conclusion a little bit. Yeah.
Well, in many ways, so this is a kind of disappointing, in many ways, this is a very disappointing presentation from the perspective of political strategy, because I don't have, so I'll say one thing that's pretty negative and one thing that's more positive. So the negative thing is that I, one, am not in, nothing really concretely is going to follow from what I take, how I think we should think about the notion of oppression, and even with regards to Black men. So it's not as if I'm going to be able to offer you, again, a political strategy here. And also ethically, I mean, I would want to be in community more so with Black feminists before recommending something that, you know, is gonna is just gonna be you know, an academic conclusion that really makes things worse, or is just uninformed. So you know, there's an ethical component to being sure about what you recommend from the basis of your theory. But one thing that is, I think, compatible with one compatible course of action, which again, compatibility is not what is not about, it doesn't follow. But one thing that's compatible is the notion of Black men and Black women being in solidarity with each other as a way of ending gender oppression. So this is something that, you know, Bell Hooks talks about when she was comparing like different ways the feminist movement might go, or different kind of strategies when it comes to the feminist movement in her book, Feminist Theory, Marching to Center. And, you know, she's comparing, okay, you know, one theory is like women, it's kind of unite as women kind of by default. And, you know, you see kind of women as unified class, and we're all in that class, and you see kind of men as this unified class. And then, you know, there's a struggle in the same way that Marxists think there's a class struggle. There's kind of gender struggle of women against men here. And that's how we kind of politically organize. And Bell Hooks kind of mentioning is like, well, I don't know if is that really the best strategy. It might be that I'm not totally sure if actually kind of organizing in that way would be the best idea. Another case that's, I'll try to keep this short because I can talk a lot, but another case is Tommy Curry actually mentions the case of Anna Julia Cooper, who has kind of, has what we would call kind of patriarchal assumptions about like political strategy when it comes to, okay, I want our Black men to be strong and protect us, and women are going to be protected by Black men, and we're going to organize together. And Curry, he raised this question. He says, look, no one calls, you know, Cooper patriarchal for, you know, having these attitudes, which clearly seem to be right against what many feminist theorists would say is the correct attitude. But I think what's interesting about that case is, or at least how I analyze it, it's like, you know, because even though Black men can be contribute to the oppression of women, you know, given the relative harms, you might take your chances with a Black man, organizing with a Black man over organizing with some other man, or organizing with white women even. And so I think what this leaves open is just the possibility that even if you have this, so this is, I think it's kind of possible weird consequence of my theory, even if you have a simplistic, arguably, view in which men oppress women, it doesn't follow from my view that you should organize principally under the banner of women and organize kind of straightforwardly against men as a class, or self-consciously against men as a class. It might actually be strategically better to recognize the social position of different groups and kind of organize with those subordinated or kind of equally, well, not equally, but oppressed groups nonetheless. So yeah, I do think there's more opportunity for Black men and women and non-binary people kind of organizing together as opposed to other theories, which I think are more simplistic, and their conclusions, they go too far when it comes to what political strategy follows from them.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. So there are a couple of questions that lead off from Kevin Samuel's example. The question around how misogynistic rhetoric continues to be divisive among Black men and Black women, and so it's sort of, to some extent, it's sort of looking at that question of how it is that we understand the forms of oppression in groups or by groups when the groups are divided, if you like, which of course is partly what you're talking about too in relation to understanding say women as a class or for example. And there's a kind of continuation of that question too, which I think goes to the issue of exemplarity a bit, and maybe also speaks to the point that you brought up in relation to my question, sort of working with definitions and then sort of fill in, move through other kinds of examples to see how they work. And so there's a question that is, that it really goes to the issue of what we mean when we talk about woman or man as well. I'm curious about your thoughts. Lee Edwards asks about where queer, gendered, trans, and gender non-conforming Black folks find themselves within this conversation around the racialized and gendered oppression of Black folks. One might also, just as an addition, sort of say, well, your example here, and I know that you are taking the example from the Tommy Curry, but your example is also quite specific. It's about a boy. It's why have the example of a boy to talk about Black men? And how do we get our heads around that, as well? So what does it mean to be a man or a woman, right? Is sort of a question there, when we're sort of thinking about trans, gender non-conforming, queer gendered boys, right? For example.
Excellent. So I think there are a number of things. I'm trying to make sure I keep track of the different elements of it. So could you say, I keep a track. So what was the stuff about, just to get the question right, what was I think there were some questions about the Kevin Samuel stuff. I missed at the beginning. What exactly? I just want to make sure I get all of your questions.
Right. I mean, the question is really about the divisiveness of Kevin Samuel. So that his remarks are divisive amongst Black men and Black women, not only towards Black women. This isn't only about sort of Black women
right
liking the comments and Black men being okay with them, but actually it's a it's a political position, obviously, that is incredibly divisive for Black folks more generally, is the way in which the questioner puts it.
Right. Okay. So I'll say a little bit about cool. I'll say a little bit about so a couple questions. So one, why a Black boy? I'm just tracking questions. So why a Black boy as the kind of paradigm example to use to talk about Black men? So I think the main reason why a Black boy is because it expresses the sheer amount of vulnerability that you're in when you are a Black boy. Now, obviously, you can be, well, not obviously, but arguably, you're kind of less vulnerable as a Black man, or at the very least, physically you have more power, you know more. So there's more there in terms of like, maybe you're less vulnerable, right? Arguably, as a Black man as opposed to a Black boy. But I think the reason why I kind of use that example, the reason I think why Curry used that example is because, in a certain way, Black men, I mean, they are in various ways, there's vulnerable as boys. I mean, they're treated in a boy-like manner, would be the idea. So that's the reason why I'm thinking that example would be one that's useful. Now, the question of, okay, what exactly is a man or a woman? So that's a very contested question in the gender feminist theory. I mean, that's going to be now. So the kind of definition that I have been, I don't have a greatest definition. I'm kind of piggybacking on this idea, a kind of social constructionist idea of man and woman, whereby you are a man to the extent that you either have are perceived to have a certain sex, or you either have or have certain body parts related to reproduction in a certain way. And, on the basis of that, people treat you in these various ways, and a kind of similar definition for a woman. So I'm of the view that gender comes in degrees. So I don't actually think that, strictly speaking, in general, I think you can be a man or a woman to more or less a degree. I think you can, of course, you can be non-binary, you can be genderqueer. I think that, I think there are many cases, there's just no fact of the matter about what your actual gender is, or at least in certain contexts, there's no fact of the matter about what gender you have. So I have written a forthcoming paper, will come out in a couple of months. I've written about actually the cases where, the kind of male, female binary is disrupted, and what the differences kind of mean for certain institutions and social structures. And so I think in this case, I really have to think more about I think part of it, and this is kind of an example of doing the bad thing I actually write about in other papers, but one thing that does happen in these discussions is kind of erasure of erasure of trans people, erasure of genderqueer, non-binary people, the erasure of people with different sexualities in the context of these questions. And that's something that I think I think we can both do certainly a better job at. I'm thinking here that the contribution in many cases, I think it's complicated because I do think that insofar as you're going down insofar as you have a marginalized identity, either sexual or gender-wise, you're less likely, arguably, to be uncritical about the kinds of misogynoir that the Kevin Samuel folks subscribe to. So I think that raises an interesting question, and I think this goes to the fact that there is a lot of division in terms of the reception of individuals like Kevin Samuels within like the Black community. And one thing I'll say about that, just briefly, hopefully it gets to your question, but I'm not totally sure if it will. Part of the reason why I think the Kevin Samuels of the world are going to be very popular in the next coming years, I think you should expect him to be on TV in the next year or two, and public national television, because one thing that he does, that he's able to be a voice for even if you don't fully subscribe to his kind of brand of misogyny, he's a voice or conduit for getting to a place that certain men and even certain women want to go. So I do want to be clear. I mean, women can definitely contribute to their own oppression. Black women can contribute to their own oppression. And I think again, let me give you an example. Kevin Samuels will do things like he'll have a woman on and she'll start talking and she'll start talking about her education and he'll play a little soundbite that goes, "I got my PhD," right? Just to mock them, just to mock the women, right? And then he'll tell them, well, you need to be focused more on your career than, focused on your job. Like your job is not, you need to, is very, very transparent. It's not, you don't have to get deep into feminist theory to think, okay, this individual is really coaching women how to be a part of patriarchal order. Women who, in many cases, I mean, they really want to be with, I mean, they really want to have a loving relationship, and they're at the point where, they're trying to accept what they take to be, harsh truths, right? Kevin Samuels is just telling me the harsh truth about the way it is. And so, yeah, like I need to stop doing all this stuff, and I need to, I need to get fit, right? Is another thing that he kind of advises women to do. So I think there is division. So I don't think it's uniformly everyone's a fan of this individual. And again, this is just kind of one example. My point is just that if you were, like, let's say someone did just, okay, check out the video, maybe share it with a friend, say, hey, this guy's really right about this woman. Like it's, okay, that's a simple contribution, right? That's not, he's not running out and doing a lot. You don't have to do a lot, is what I'm saying. And in theory, I'm just thinking, okay, do you really have to do a lot? Do you really have to have control over all of these different institutions in society? I mean, in order to contribute to the oppression of women or contribute to the oppression of Black women? And I just think, no, I mean, it could be an everyday thing. I'm not saying, look, you might be dating someone and that's what they actually, express those attitudes. Does that mean you should dump them? I mean, maybe it depends on where you are, but I'm saying it's not automatic that your relationship, or you should end your relationship with this person on the basis of this, because you take it to be, oh, they have such a vicious character. I mean, sometimes people do, but I don't think that's the norm. I think the norm is, a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that there's a question of a different sort now, and I think it would be interesting for you to say more about it. Eric Carter thanks you for your interesting talk and has a clarificatory question. Can you say more about your minimalist approach to oppression? What makes the view minimalist? How does it differ from approaches that are more than minimal?
Good. So I think that the reason why I call it minimalist, and maybe this might be just a point of emphasis, maybe some of these theories, maybe everyone was minimalist all along, but the reason why I call it minimalist is because often in discussions of oppression, it seems to me that people just infer more about what oppression is like than what to me seems to be going into the concept. So when I think about, okay, Curry has written about Black male vulnerability, and he would definitely be opposed to this idea that Black men oppress women. So I asked myself, well, what does he think? What would he think must be required for Black men to oppress women? And because the examples, again, he goes through the list of examples that Black feminists give to him about the extent to which Black men oppress women, and he automatically, I mean, he's kind of dismissive of them, and he goes to, look, here's some empirical facts that we know about Black men. They experience this, they experience this, they experience this, they experience this. This is, look at how bad these things are, even relative to Black women. And to me, I'm inferring that he thinks that Black men just have to be in a certain structural position in terms of like how much power they have over women or Black women. Black men have to be large, beneficiaries of, they get a lot of benefits from this stuff, that the benefits are stable. So that's another thing that I didn't say much about, but it also, when we talk about this concept of male, Black male privilege, right? And I think that's why I don't talk about privilege, because I have problems with it, because, privilege, if you think about Black male privilege, there's an implication, I think, of stability that I just don't think applies in the case of Black men. I mean, to benefit from kind of harming women, those benefits may not be stable. And I think that's especially true when it comes to Black men. I think in some cases, you can get certain benefits. In other cases, you just may not get those same benefits, or you may get fewer benefits than you might have thought. And so, yeah, the reason why I call it minimalist is my perception that people think oppression requires more. Maybe this perception is wrong, in which case I have to reconfigure how I want to kind of frame this. But that's my reasoning behind minimalism. Oh, the last thing I'll mention, is that there's not so men oppress women. Take that claim. That's a bad state of affairs. Okay, that's true. But I don't think there's straightforward claims that come from that, other than we should stop the oppression of women by men, right? And I think on other theories, they say more because they think, oh, it should be an informative. Our theory needs to be informative, therefore it should say a lot more. But I'm thinking, instead of doing that, I would like my theory to be modular. I would like to have this concept of oppression, which does this very particular thing. And then I have my theory of misogyny here. And then I have my theory of intersectionality here that can play a role, right? And can navigate those three different concepts. So that's, part of, I want to kind of divide things up and then put them together in a compositional way. That's my reasoning.
Thank you. There's a question from Antonio Randolph, who asks, how have you engaged with empirical critiques of Curry's work, such as Paul Butler's critique of Black male exceptionalism, which argues that racialized sexism is a fundamental structure that harm Black men and women differently but equally?
This is really great. So let me pull up. I actually have in my paper, I actually talk about the concept of Black male exceptionalism that Butler talks about. So good. So yeah. So Paul Butler critiques this idea of Black male exceptionalism, which is, and this is a quote here, the view that by almost every index of inequality, Black males are on the bottom, exceptionally burdened and marginalized. So Butler concludes that Black men are neither absolutely worse off than other social groups, nor are Black men always worse off relative to Black women. And he also, he's against this idea that, like, there's a saying of Black men are an endangered species. And he thinks that's kind of harmful. It's harmful. It overstates the case. I mean, there are lots of problems with thinking of Black men are endangered species. So he's against that. And I think Butler and Curry, they are kind of, Curry's response to Butler is kind of like, you acknowledge, you're trying to find a way to show that Black men are really the oppressors, despite acknowledging all the things that are going on with Black men. So my impression of this, though, is that, Butler seems to be kind of tempering the conclusion. I think I see Butler as tempering some of the more radical conclusions that I think that Curry draws in his work, right? So I think that Curry may be overstating the case. I do think that saying Black men are endangered species, I think that may be overstating the case in terms of the condition of Black men in the United States. So I do think that, like, Curry in particular is kind of, and I think it's something that Butler points out, he doesn't, he gets a little fuzzy with the, like, income situation as far as Black men are earning more than Black women. And so, there's evidence there. There are cases where, Black men might be doing better off than Black women in certain metrics, but they're not doing like much work. I mean, they're not doing, in some cases, like, well, you're doing better, but not much better, right? It's okay. Should that really count? So I think that, Butler says he does think that Black men are in a state of crisis, but he just thinks the state has been exaggerated. And so for me, I don't see that as, I don't think that, I nonetheless don't think that takes away from the entirety of what Curry is putting forward here. So I think it tempers it a bit because, Curry makes, it's a big book. He makes a lot of claims and he really goes in hard on a lot of feminist theorists. And just, so I think, and especially he has a discussion of intimate personal violence, which is, yes, so I think some of his claims are exaggerated. I'll just put it like that. But I don't think that takes away from the idea of Black male vulnerability. I just think it tempers it, is basically my thought. So I do think the challenge still remains, even if, Butler is right that, okay, some of this stuff is, it's a little bit too much, right? And the reason why, and I'll just add this, the reason why is because what I really like about his concept of Black male vulnerability is that, unlike, sometimes in this discussion, this happens a lot among liberal feminists, you just have, okay, here's, you have metrics of well-being, and then you just start comparing them. And then you start adding up, okay, who's doing better here? Who's doing better here? Who's doing better here? I don't think that's the way to go. I think that's important, that's evidence of something, but we're not going to identify a structural feature of society just by seeing, relatively speaking, who's better. Because it's for sure, if there was a trade, okay, Black women earn more than Black men, and we can trade for police violence. Like, that's not that's not where we want to go. But yeah, I think Butler is tempering these claims.
Thank you so much. Well, Kevin, we are at time now. In fact, we're beyond time. I'm going to ask Jennifer to please copy all the questions for you so you can take a look at them yourself. And I just want to use this opportunity again to welcome you to Duke, and hopefully at some point in person, and to thank you for your talk today and conversation. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate this.
Thank you.